The date was March 15th, 1944. Captain Robert Buck Henderson gripped the control stick of his P-47 Thunderbolt as flak exploded around him over the skies of Brandenburg, Germany. What should have been a routine escort mission was about to become the most harrowing 37 minutes of aerial combat in World War II history. 35 of the Luftwaffe's most decorated fighter pilots were converging on his position, and Buck was completely alone, separated from his squadron by a wall of enemy fighters. This is the true story of how one American pilot survived an encounter that military historians still study today, a story of skill, determination, and the incredible engineering of the aircraft that refused to go down. If you're fascinated by incredible stories of survival and aviation history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the most compelling true stories from history every week. The morning had started like any other at RAF Bodisham in Cambridgeshire, England. Buck Henderson woke at 0500 hours to the sound of rain hammering against the corrugated metal roof of his barracks. He was 24 years old, a farm boy from Nebraska who'd never seen an airplane up close until he enlisted in 1942. Now he was a captain in the 56th Fighter Group with 17 confirmed kills to his name. He'd been flying combat missions for 8 months, and the strain was beginning to show. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his hands had developed a slight tremor that only disappeared when he was in the cockpit. The barracks at RAF Bodisham were typical of American air bases in England during the war, long, drafty buildings with thin walls that did little to keep out the perpetual dampness of the English countryside. Buck's cot was one of 24 lined up in neat rows, each with a small footlocker at its base containing the sum total of a pilot's worldly possessions in this foreign land. Photographs of sweethearts and families, letters from home, a few books, maybe a bottle of whiskey hidden beneath spare socks. The walls were bare wood, decorated only by pin-up girls torn from magazines and hand-drawn squadron insignias. Buck swung his legs out of bed and felt the cold floor through his wool socks. Around him, other pilots were stirring, going through their own morning rituals. Some wrote letters they hoped wouldn't be their last. Others played cards or read dog-eared paperbacks. A few, the ones who'd been at it longest, simply sat and smoked, staring at nothing, their minds already in the sky preparing for what was to come. The sound of coughing echoed through the barracks. Lieutenant James Red Morrison, so called for his shock of bright red hair, was bent over his footlocker, his body racked with deep, wet coughs. He'd caught a cold 3 weeks ago that had settled into his chest, but he refused to report to the flight surgeon. Being grounded meant letting down your squadron, and that was unacceptable. Buck made a mental note to check on Red after the mission, maybe force him to see the doc whether he wanted to or not. Buck pulled on his uniform slowly, methodically. First the olive drab shirt, then the trousers with their sharp creases maintained by sleeping with them under his mattress. His leather jacket came next, the sheepskin lining soft against his skin. It was a ritual, this dressing for combat, and like all rituals, it brought a measure of comfort and control to a situation where both were in short supply. He checked his pockets automatically. Escape kit with silk maps, compass, and foreign currency. Dog tags around his neck, his lucky silver dollar from his grandfather, worn smooth from years of handling. Outside, the dawn was breaking gray and wet over Cambridgeshire. The airfield was already alive with activity despite the early hour. Ground crews swarmed over the P-47 Thunderbolts lined up on the hard stands, performing last-minute checks, loading ammunition, topping off fuel tanks. The smell of high-octane aviation gasoline hung heavy in the damp air, mixing with the acrid scent of oil and the ever-present mud that seemed to cover everything in England. Buck walked across the tarmac, his boots splashing through puddles. He could see his aircraft from 100 yards away. Prairie Thunder sat on its hard stand like a coiled predator, all 7 tons of American engineering and firepower. The ground crew chief, Technical Sergeant Mike Kowalski, was standing on the wing, checking something in the engine compartment. Kowalski was a 35-year-old mechanic from Detroit who could disassemble and reassemble an R-2800 engine blindfolded. He loved these aircraft like they were his children, and he took personal offense when the Germans put holes in them. "Morning, Ski," Buck called out. "How's she looking today?" Kowalski glanced down, his weathered face breaking into a slight smile. "Morning, Captain. She's purring like a kitten. Changed the oil yesterday, checked all the connections, test-fired the guns at dawn, 850s, all functioning perfectly. You've got full ammo load, 3,250 rounds. Fuel tanks are topped off. That's 370 gallons internal, plus 2 100-gallon drop tanks. You could fly to Berlin and back twice." Buck climbed up onto the wing and peered into the engine compartment. The massive R-2800 double wasp radial engine gleamed with fresh oil. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, each one precisely maintained by Kowalski and his crew. This engine was the heart of the P-47, the source of its incredible power and durability. It could take damage that would destroy lesser engines and keep running. Buck had seen P-47s come home with cylinders shot away, oil lines severed, cooling fins torn off, and the R-2800 still turning over, still providing enough power to get its pilot home. "Any squawks from yesterday's mission?" Buck asked. "Nothing major, sir. Had a hydraulic leak on the port landing gear, but we replaced the line. Patched up a few flak holes in the tail section. Nothing structural. She's ready to go to war." Kowalski paused, then added quietly, "You bring her back in one piece, Captain? I put a lot of work into this bird." Buck met the older man's eyes and nodded. "I'll do my best, Ski. Always do." The walk to the mess hall took Buck past the operations building, where staff officers were already at work planning missions, coordinating with Bomber Command, analyzing reconnaissance photos. Through the windows, he could see them hunched over maps and charts, drinking coffee from chipped mugs, smoking cigarettes that added to the permanent haze that filled the room. These men rarely flew anymore, but they bore their own burden of responsibility. Every mission they planned, every target they selected meant American boys might not come home. It was a weight that showed in their lined faces and gray hair. He dressed quickly in the cold morning air, pulling on his fleece-lined leather jacket and wool trousers. The smell of coffee and fried eggs drifted from the mess hall, mixing with the ever-present odor of aviation fuel and damp earth. Buck joined his squadron mates at their usual table. Lieutenant Tommy Walsh, his wingman, was pushing scrambled eggs around his plate without eating them. Walsh was 19, fresh-faced despite 4 months of combat, and he couldn't hide his nervousness before missions. The mess hall was a converted aircraft hangar, drafty and poorly heated, but it was dry and the food was hot, which made it a palace by military standards. Long wooden tables filled the space, each one crowded with pilots in various stages of wakefulness. Some ate with mechanical efficiency, fueling their bodies for the mission ahead. Others couldn't manage more than coffee, their stomachs too tight with pre-mission nerves. The cooks, soldiers themselves who'd never see combat but kept the warriors fed, moved behind the serving line with practiced efficiency. Buck filled his tray with scrambled eggs, toast, and bacon, then grabbed a mug of coffee so strong it could strip paint. He'd learned early in his combat career to eat before missions, no matter how nervous he felt. A man couldn't fly and fight for 5 or 6 hours on an empty stomach. The body needed fuel just like the aircraft did. At the table, Tommy Walsh was drawing patterns in his eggs with his fork, his young face pale. Walsh had arrived at the squadron in November, a replacement for Lieutenant Eddie Martinez, who'd been shot down over Hamburg. Martinez had been 23, married with a baby daughter he'd never met. His P-47 had taken a direct hit from flak, and he'd gone down so fast he hadn't even had time to radio. One moment he was there, the next he was a ball of flame falling from the sky. Walsh had moved into Martinez's empty bunk that same night, sleeping under the dead man's blanket, and Buck knew the kid thought about that every single day. "You need to eat, Tommy," Buck said, sitting down across from him. "It's going to be a long day." Walsh looked up, managed a weak smile. "Not very hungry, sir. Stomach's doing flips. I know the feeling. Been there myself. Still am, if I'm being honest." Buck took a bite of toast, chewed, swallowed. "But you've got to eat anyway. Your body doesn't care if you're nervous. It needs fuel. So does your brain. Can't think straight on an empty stomach, and thinking straight up there is what keeps you alive." Captain Daniel Foster, Buck's element leader and a fellow Nebraskan, sat down next to them with a tray piled high with food. Foster was 26, tall and lanky, with a slow drawl that became more pronounced when he was stressed. He had 22 kills to his name, making him one of the top aces in the squadron. He also had a wife and 2 kids back in Omaha, their photos tucked into his jacket pocket next to his heart. "Heard from my Sarah last night," Foster said, attacking his breakfast with enthusiasm. "She says little Danny lost his first tooth. 6 years old already. Can you believe that? Seems like yesterday he was just a baby." Buck smiled. "Time moves fast. War makes it feel even faster." "Too damn fast," Foster agreed. "Some days I feel like an old man. 26, going on 60. He paused, looked at Walsh. "You gonna eat that, kid, or just redecorate your plate?" Walsh flushed. "Sorry, sir. Just not hungry." Foster's expression softened. "I get it, Tommy. But Buck's right. Force it down. We've got a long mission today, and you'll need your strength. Trust me, I've made the mistake of skipping breakfast before a mission. By the time we're over the target, you'll be so hungry you can't think straight. And up there, not thinking straight means dying." The words were blunt, but not unkind. Foster had a way of being direct without being cruel, and Walsh responded to it. The young lieutenant picked up his fork and began eating, slowly at first, then with more enthusiasm as his body remembered it needed food. Around them, the mess hall buzzed with conversation. Pilots talked about the mission, about the weather, about anything except the fear that sat in all their stomachs like a cold stone. It was gallows humor mostly, jokes about the Germans, about the missions, about death itself. Laughing at death was a way of denying its power over you, of pretending you weren't terrified every single time you climbed into that cockpit. Lieutenant Jake Crash Sullivan, who'd earned his nickname by surviving 3 belly landings and 2 bailouts, was holding court at the next table. So this kraut comes at me yesterday, guns blazing, and I think I'm done for. But then his engine starts smoking and he breaks off. Turns out his own ground crew had sabotaged his bird. I heard they're using slave laborers in the factories now, and those poor bastards are doing whatever they can to stick it to the Nazis. I swear that forced laborer saved my life, and he'll never even know it. The story was probably exaggerated, maybe even completely made up. But it didn't matter. It gave the pilots something to think about besides their own mortality. It reminded them that they weren't just fighting the Luftwaffe. They were part of something bigger, a global struggle against tyranny. On days when the fear threatened to overwhelm, that perspective helped. Buck finished his breakfast and checked his watch. 6:30. Briefing in 30 minutes. He had time for one more cup of coffee and a cigarette. He didn't smoke much, never had, but before missions, he allowed himself one. It was another ritual, another small piece of control in a situation where control was an illusion. "Another milk run to Berlin," Walsh said, trying to sound casual. 8th Air Force is hitting the ball-bearing plants again. Buck nodded, sipping his bitter coffee. "Stay tight on my wing, Tommy." The Jerrys have been throwing up more fighters lately. Intelligence says they're consolidating their best pilots into special units. The words hung in the air between them. Special units. Everyone knew what that meant. The Luftwaffe was pulling back its veteran pilots, its aces with dozens or even hundreds of kills, and grouping them together into elite squadrons. These weren't the green kids fresh from flight school that the Germans had been forced to rely on as their pilot training program collapsed under the weight of attrition. These were the survivors, the killers, the men who'd been fighting since Poland or France or the Battle of Britain. They knew every trick, every tactic, and they had the kills to prove it. Tommy swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Yes, sir. Tight on your wing. I remember." Major William Jameson, their squadron commander, stood at the head of the table and cleared his throat. The room fell silent. Jameson was 31, ancient by fighter pilot standards, with a weathered face and steady gray eyes that had seen too much. "Gentlemen, today's mission is Big Week continued. We're escorting B-17s to the Daimler-Benz factory complex outside Berlin. Expected enemy resistance is heavy. The Luftwaffe knows we're coming, and they'll throw everything they have at us. Our job is to keep those bombers safe. Questions?" No one spoke. They'd all heard the briefing before in various forms. The names of the targets changed, but the mission was always the same. Protect the bombers, kill enemy fighters, come home alive. 2 out of 3 wasn't bad, but everyone wanted to be there when the war ended. Jameson had been flying fighters since before most of his pilots could shave. He'd flown in North Africa, then Sicily, then transferred to England when the 8th Air Force started building up for the big push into Germany. He had 38 confirmed kills, more than enough to go home if he wanted, but he'd chosen to stay. Someone had to lead these boys, to teach them how to survive, and Jameson took that responsibility seriously. It showed in the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the way he watched his pilots like a father watching his sons go off to war. "One more thing," Jameson added, his voice grave. "Intelligence reports indicate that Jägerschwader 3 and JG-11 are both operating in the Berlin defense sector. For those of you who don't follow German unit designations, that's bad news. JG-3 is one of their oldest and most decorated fighter wings. They've got at least a dozen aces in their ranks, including some with over 100 kills. JG-11 is newer, but just as deadly. They've been equipped with the latest Focke-Wulf 190s, and their pilots are hand-picked veterans. Expect professional coordinated attacks. These guys aren't going to make stupid mistakes. You'll have to outfly them and outshoot them, and that means being on your game every second you're in the combat zone. Understood?" A chorus of "yes, sir" echoed through the mess hall, but Buck could hear the tension in the voices. Fighting the Luftwaffe's elite was a different proposition than bouncing green replacements. These German pilots would work in pairs and fours, covering each other, setting traps, using altitude and sun and clouds to their advantage. They'd been doing this for years, and they were very, very good at it. The briefing room was thick with cigarette smoke as the pilots gathered around the large map table. Intelligence Officer Captain Richard Barnes pointed to the route with his wooden stick. "You'll cross the channel at Dover, make landfall near Calais, then proceed east-northeast to the IP. Initial point, here, 20 miles west of Berlin. Weather is overcast with broken clouds at 15,000 feet, visibility moderate. Flak will be intense over the target area. The Luftwaffe has been pulling back their fighters to defend the Reich, so expect Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s in strength. Also reports of some of their top aces operating in the area. Barnes was a bookish man with wire-rimmed glasses and a receding hairline. He'd never flown a combat mission in his life, but he was brilliant at piecing together intelligence from reconnaissance photos, radio intercepts, prisoner interrogations, and resistance reports. The pilots trusted his assessments because they were almost always accurate. When Barnes said, "Expect heavy resistance," you could bet your life that heavy resistance was exactly what you'd get. Weather over the target is forecast to be partly cloudy with good visibility, Barnes continued, moving his pointer across the map. That's good for the bombers, but also good for the defenders. The Luftwaffe will have plenty of opportunities to intercept. Flak batteries around Berlin have been reinforced significantly in the past month. The Germans know we're hitting their industrial targets hard, and they're putting up everything they have to stop us. We estimate over 500 heavy and medium anti-aircraft guns in the target area alone. A pilot in the back row whistled low. 500 guns? Jesus. Yes, 500, Barnes confirmed, which is why you'll stay above 15,000 feet when possible and keep your speed up when transiting the flak zones. The 88mm guns are effective up to 30,000 feet, so altitude alone won't save you. Speed and evasive action are your friends. He tapped the map again, indicating the route. Timing is critical on this mission. The bombers will be starting their run at 0945. You need to be in position by 0930 to provide coverage. That means wheels up at 0815, no delays. Any mechanical issues, any problems, you abort and return to base. We can't have stragglers. The formations need to stay tight. Buck studied the map, memorizing landmarks, checkpoints, alternate routes in case they got separated or had to divert. The route took them over some of the most heavily defended airspace in Europe. Hundreds of German fighters would be scrambling to intercept. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns would be filling the sky with steel, and through it all, the bombers would press on toward their targets, relying on the fighter escort to keep them alive, long enough to deliver their bombs. One more item, Barnes said, his voice dropping slightly. We've received reports that the Luftwaffe may be employing a new tactic. They're using heavily armed and armored Focke-Wulf 190s, specifically equipped to attack bomber formations. These Sturmgruppen, as they call them, are designed to get in close and stay there, absorbing defensive fire while they pound away at the bombers. They're escorted by standard fighters whose job is to keep our escorts off them. If you see this tactic being employed, priority one is to break up those Sturm formations before they reach the bombers. Understood? More nods, more grim faces. The Germans were getting desperate, which made them more dangerous. A desperate enemy fights harder, takes more risks, accepts casualties that a confident enemy would avoid. The Luftwaffe knew they were losing the war in the air, losing it slowly but inexorably, and that made every mission more deadly. All right, gentlemen, Jameson said, standing up. Check your watches. I have 0700 hours exactly. Mark, we walk at 0750. Questions? Captain Foster raised his hand. Sir, what's the recall signal if weather closes in? Red flare from the tower means abort and return to base, but weather is expected to hold, so barring something unexpected, we're going. Anything else? Jameson scanned the room, his eyes meeting each pilot's in turn. No? Then dismissed. And gentlemen, be careful up there. Every one of you is important. Every one of you matters. Fly smart, watch your wingman, and come home. That's an order. Buck felt his stomach tighten. The Luftwaffe's elite pilots were dangerous, men who'd been fighting since the beginning of the war, who had hundreds of missions and dozens of kills. They knew every trick, every advantage, and they fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland. By 0900 hours, Buck was strapped into the cockpit of his P-47 Thunderbolt. The aircraft was a beast, weighing 7 tons empty and powered by a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine that produced 2,000 horsepower. The plane was nicknamed Jug because of its bulky, jug-like appearance, but Buck had named his particular aircraft Prairie Thunder, after the storms that rolled across Nebraska in the summer. The name was painted on the nose, along with 17 small swastikas representing his confirmed kills. The cockpit of the P-47 was tight but efficient, every instrument and control positioned within easy reach. Buck settled into the seat, feeling the familiar contours of the cushions beneath him. The seat was armored, a thick plate of steel behind him that would stop rifle-caliber rounds and shrapnel. It added weight, but it had saved countless pilots from being shot in the back by pursuing fighters. In front of him, the instrument panel was a complex array of gauges and dials. Altimeter, airspeed indicator, vertical speed indicator, artificial horizon, turn and bank indicator, compass, engine RPM, manifold pressure, fuel level, oil pressure, oil temperature, cylinder head temperature. Each one told him something vital about his aircraft's status. Above the instrument panel, the gun sight was mounted, a simple but effective device that helped him aim his weapons. 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns were mounted in his wings, 4 in each wing, with over 3,000 rounds of ammunition feeding them. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, the P-47 produced a devastating stream of projectiles that could tear apart any aircraft in the sky. The guns were synchronized to converge at 300 yards, creating a cone of fire that was nearly impossible to fly through without taking hits. Buck's hands moved over the controls with practiced familiarity. Control stick, centered and free. Throttle in the idle position. Mixture control, set to auto-rich. Propeller pitch, set to full increase. Landing gear lever, down and locked. Flaps, up. Trim tabs, neutral. Oxygen regulator, on and flowing. Radio, channel set to squadron frequency. Gun sight, on and illuminated. Everything was exactly as it should be, a testament to Kowalski and his ground crew's meticulous work. He ran through his pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency. Fuel, full. Oxygen, working. Guns, 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns, armed and loaded with over 3,000 rounds of ammunition. Radio, functional. Engine temperature, normal. Everything was ready. Buck reached up and pulled his leather helmet on, fastening the chin strap snugly. The helmet was fitted with radio earphones and a throat microphone, allowing him to communicate with his squadron mates in ground control. Over the helmet went his goggles, pushed up on his forehead for now, but ready to be pulled down if needed. His oxygen mask hung loose around his neck, connected to the aircraft's oxygen system by a ribbed rubber hose. At altitude, where the air was too thin to breathe, that mask would be his lifeline. Outside the cockpit, Kowalski was standing on the wing making final checks. He reached in and tapped Buck on the shoulder, then pointed to various switches and controls, double-checking that everything was set correctly. It was a ritual they'd developed over months of working together, a final verification before Buck put his life in the hands of the machine Kowalski had prepared. "You're all set, Captain," Kowalski said, his voice carrying over the ambient noise of the airfield. "She'll fly like a dream, I guarantee it." "Thanks, Ski," Buck replied, giving the crew chief a thumbs up. "See you in a few hours." Kowalski climbed down from the wing and signaled to his ground crew. They pulled the wheel chocks away from the landing gear and took up positions around the aircraft, ready to watch for any problems during engine start. This was the moment of truth, when the dormant machine would come roaring to life, when the mission would truly begin. Buck flipped the battery switch on, checked that the magneto switches were off, then engaged the fuel boost pump. He could hear the electric motor whirring as it built pressure in the fuel lines. The primer pump came next, flooding the cylinders with fuel to aid starting. Then he set the mixture to idle cutoff, ensuring the engine wouldn't fire until he was ready. "Clear prop!" Buck shouted, though he knew Kowalski's crew was already well clear. It was procedure, ingrained through countless hours of training. Safety first, always. He pressed the starter button. The starter motor whined, turning the massive propeller slowly at first, then faster. The engine began to catch, one cylinder firing, then another, then all 18 roaring to life in a thunderous cacophony that shook the entire aircraft. Smoke belched from the exhaust stacks as unburned fuel ignited. The R-2800 Double Wasp settled into a rough idle, the propeller spinning in a blur, the whole aircraft vibrating with barely contained power. The engine roared to life with a thunderous bellow that Buck felt in his chest. He taxied into position behind Major Jameson's aircraft and waited for the signal. When it came, he pushed the throttle forward and felt the incredible surge of power as Prairie Thunder accelerated down the runway. The tail came up, the rumbling stopped, and suddenly he was airborne, climbing into the gray English sky. The sensation of takeoff never got old. One moment you were earthbound, wheels rumbling on concrete, and the next you were flying, free of gravity's grasp, climbing into the sky. Buck eased back on the stick and felt Prairie Thunder respond, her nose lifting, the runway falling away beneath him. The landing gear came up with a hydraulic whine and a solid thunk as the wheels locked into their wells. Airspeed increased rapidly, 80 knots, 100, 120, 140. He pulled back on the throttle slightly, adjusting to a sustainable climb speed, and concentrated on forming up with the rest of the squadron. All around him, other P-47s were taking off at 30-second intervals, each one thundering down the runway and leaping into the sky. Within minutes, 48 Thunderbolts were airborne, climbing and maneuvering into formation. It was a ballet of sorts, each pilot judging distances and speeds, making constant small adjustments to slide into his assigned position. Buck found his place in blue flight with Tommy Walsh on his right wing, and together they climbed toward the rendezvous point. The squadron formed up over the channel, 48 P-47s arranged in flights of 4. Buck settled into his position with Tommy Walsh on his right wing. Below them, the dark waters of the English Channel were choppy with white caps. Above, the sky was a solid ceiling of gray clouds. They climbed to 25,000 feet, where the temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero, despite the cockpit heater. They crossed into occupied France at 0940. The countryside below was a patchwork of brown fields and small villages. Buck scanned the sky constantly, his eyes never still, searching for the telltale glint of sunlight on a canopy or the dark spots that could be enemy fighters. His fingers rested lightly on the control stick, ready to react in an instant. The radio crackled with chatter. Lead bottle leader, this is ramrod leader. We have bogeys, 12 o'clock high, Angels 28. That was the bomber formation commander reporting enemy aircraft at 28,000 feet, directly ahead and above them. Buck's pulse quickened. He tightened his oxygen mask and flexed his gloved fingers. Blue flight, this is blue leader. Tighten it up. Keep your eyes open. Tommy Walsh's voice came through, tight with tension. Blue leader, blue 2. I've got them. Looks like a whole swarm of 109s. Buck saw them now, tiny black dots against the clouds, growing larger as the distance closed. Messerschmitt BF 109s, probably a dozen of them, diving toward the bomber formation. Blue flight, prepare to engage. On my mark, we break left and climb. 3, 2, 1, mark. He hauled back on the stick and pushed the throttle to full war emergency power. The P-47 responded with a surge that pressed him back into his seat. The engine roared, the supercharger whined, and Prairie Thunder clawed for altitude. Buck's flight followed, 4 Thunderbolts climbing to intercept the diving Messerschmitts. The first engagement happened fast. Buck fired a burst at a 109 that flashed across his nose. Saw his tracers arc toward the enemy fighter but miss as it rolled away. He pulled hard right, grunting against the G-forces, keeping his eyes on the swirling dogfight. Tommy was still with him. Good. A Focke-Wulf 190 appeared in front of Buck, pulling up from a diving attack on a bomber. Buck led the target, squeezed the trigger, and felt his aircraft shudder as all 8 guns fired. The 190 staggered as 50 caliber rounds stitched across its wing root, then exploded in a ball of fire. 17 became 18. But the Luftwaffe wasn't giving up. More fighters appeared, at least 30 of them. They were aggressive, experienced. Buck recognized the tactics of veteran pilots, the way they worked in pairs, covering each other, setting up firing solutions with brutal efficiency. These weren't the green replacements the Luftwaffe had been sending up lately. These were the old hands, the survivors. The bombers were taking hits. Buck saw a B-17 trailing smoke from its number 3 engine, falling behind the formation. 2 109s latched onto it like wolves on a wounded elk. Buck rolled inverted and dived, building speed rapidly. The P-47 accelerated like a falling anvil, reaching 450 miles per hour in seconds. He closed on the nearest 109, fired, and saw pieces fly off its tail. The German pilot broke off, but his wingman was already turning toward Buck. What happened next would be burned into Buck's memory forever. He was lining up on the second 109 when something slammed into his aircraft with tremendous force. The cockpit filled with the smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid. His right wing was shredded, with gaping holes torn through the metal skin. One of his guns was hanging loose, dangling from its mount. The control stick felt mushy, the aircraft wanting to roll right. Buck fought the controls, scanning for his attacker. He found him immediately, a 109 painted in black and white stripes pulling up for another pass. But that wasn't the worst of it. As Buck looked around, his blood ran cold. There were enemy fighters everywhere, and they were all focusing on him. 5, 10, 15 more. He counted them rapidly. 35 German fighters, and they'd all apparently decided that the damaged American was easy prey. Blue 2, blue leader, I'm hit, and I've got company. Break off and rejoin the squadron. Buck's voice was steady, despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Blue leader, negative. I'm staying with you. Tommy's voice was high-pitched with fear, but determined. That's an order, Lieutenant. Get out of here. Buck snapped the words out, then yanked his stick hard left as tracers streaked past his canopy. He couldn't protect Tommy and survive this himself. He needed Walsh to live, to tell people what happened here. There was a long pause, then Walsh's voice thick with emotion. Good luck, Captain. Give 'em hell. Buck watched Tommy's P-47 roll away and dive toward the west, toward safety. Then he was alone, 1 damaged fighter against 35 of the Luftwaffe's best. The smart move would be to run, to point the nose west and use the P-47's legendary dive speed to escape. But Buck looked down at the bombers, saw them still pressing toward the target, saw another B-17 take a hit and begin its death spiral, and he made his decision. He'd hold the Germans here as long as he could. Every second they spent trying to kill him was a second they weren't killing bomber crews. He turned into the nearest attacker, a 109 with a bright yellow nose, and opened fire. The German pilot, surprised by the aggressive move from a damaged aircraft, broke off his attack run. Buck didn't wait to see the result. He reversed his turn, pulled hard, and went after another 109 that was setting up on a bomber's 6 o'clock. The next 37 minutes were a blur of violence and survival. Buck twisted, turned, dived, and climbed, using every ounce of the P-47's ruggedness and his own skill to stay alive. The Germans came at him from every angle, in pairs and groups, and he met each attack with determined aggression. His damaged aircraft shook and groaned, but it kept flying. That was the genius of the P-47's design. It could absorb punishment that would destroy lesser aircraft. Every second was a battle. Buck's world narrowed to the immediate threats around him, his peripheral vision scanning for danger while his conscious mind focused on the fighter in front of him. A 109 came at him from his 2 o'clock high, and Buck pulled into a climbing turn, using his aircraft's superior power to gain altitude while turning into the threat. The German pilot, expecting Buck to run or dive, was caught off guard and overshot. Buck reversed his turn, dropped his nose, and fired a quick burst that stitched holes across the 109's wing. The German broke off, trailing smoke. Another pair of Focke-Wulf 190s tried to bracket him, one high and one low, attempting to force Buck into a position where he had nowhere to go. It was a classic tactic, perfected by veteran Luftwaffe pilots, who'd been using it since the beginning of the war. But Buck had seen it before, and knew the counter. He throttled back suddenly, reducing speed dramatically, and both 190s shot past him. He selected the lower one, fired, and watched his rounds tear into the German's engine cowling. The 190 nosed over and dove away, trailing a stream of coolant that turned to white vapor in the cold air. But for every German he damaged or drove off, 2 more seemed to take their place. They were relentless, professional, working together with the kind of coordination that only came from hundreds of hours of combat experience. Buck could see them setting up attacks, communicating with each other, using hand signals when their radios failed or when radio silence was tactical. These weren't the panicked, disorganized swarms of fighters he'd encountered in earlier missions. This was the Luftwaffe's elite, and they were demonstrating exactly why they'd earned that reputation. He took more hits. A 20mm cannon shell exploded against his engine cowling, punching a hole the size of a dinner plate through the metal. Another burst walked across his left wing, tearing off his aileron trim tab. His canopy cracked when a round glanced off it, spiderwebbing the plexiglass. But the R-2800 engine kept running, that magnificent piece of American engineering refusing to quit. Buck could hear it laboring, could feel the vibration through the airframe, but it gave him power when he needed it. The engine's continued operation was nothing short of miraculous. The R-2800 Double Wasp had been designed with redundancy and ruggedness in mind. Its 18 cylinders meant that even if several were damaged or destroyed, the remaining cylinders could still provide power. The dual magneto ignition system ensured that even if one ignition system failed, the other would keep firing the spark plugs. Oil lines were routed through protected channels, and critical components were positioned behind armor plate. It was an engine designed to bring pilots home, and it was doing exactly that for Buck Henderson. Buck's ammunition was running low. He could see the counter on his gun sight decreasing with every burst. Each time he pressed the trigger, 8 guns fired simultaneously, consuming ammunition at a prodigious rate. The 50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun fired at approximately 800 rounds per minute per gun, meaning his full battery of 8 guns could theoretically fire over 6,000 rounds per minute. Of course, in combat, pilots fired in short bursts to conserve ammunition and improve accuracy. But even disciplined burst firing consumed ammunition rapidly, and Buck had been fighting for over 30 minutes. He shot down 2 more Germans in that chaotic fight. A 109 made the mistake of crossing in front of him at close range, and Buck's guns cut it in half. The German aircraft simply came apart in midair, the fuselage separating from the wings in a catastrophic structural failure. Pieces tumbled through the sky, and Buck had to jink hard to avoid flying through the debris field. He caught a glimpse of the pilot, still strapped in his seat, falling away toward the earth far below. There was no parachute. The man was already dead, killed instantly when Buck's rounds found him. A Focke-Wulf 190 tried to outrun him in a dive, but the P-47 was faster going down, and Buck caught it at 7,000 feet, his bullets starting a fire that turned into an inferno. The German pilot bailed out, his parachute opening just seconds before his aircraft hit the ground. The 190 had made a critical mistake. Its pilot, perhaps panicking after taking hits, had chosen to dive straight away rather than using evasive maneuvers. The Focke-Wulf 190 was an excellent aircraft, possibly the best fighter the Germans had, but in a straight dive from altitude, the P-47 Thunderbolt was unmatched. Its weight, which made it sluggish in turning fights, became an asset in dives. Gravity and that powerful engine combined to accelerate the Thunderbolt to speeds that lighter aircraft simply couldn't match. Buck had pushed his airspeed to over 500 miles per hour in the chase, the aircraft shaking violently from the compressibility effects that occurred when approaching the speed of sound, but it held together and gave him the speed he needed to catch his prey. But Buck was running out of everything. His ammunition counters showed less than 200 rounds remaining. His fuel gauge was dropping rapidly from all the violent maneuvering and possible fuel tank damage, and the German pilots were getting smarter, more coordinated. They'd realized he wouldn't run, so now they were setting up carefully planned attacks designed to bracket him, to leave him nowhere to go. The Germans had clearly recognized that they were dealing with an exceptional pilot in an aircraft that refused to die. Their tactics shifted from opportunistic attacks to coordinated assaults designed to overwhelm his defenses. 4 109s would approach from different angles simultaneously, forcing Buck to choose which threat to address while accepting hits from the others. It was a brutal calculus, and Buck found himself taking more and more damage as the Germans refined their approach. His breathing was labored now, despite the oxygen flowing through his mask. The physical exertion of combat flying was enormous. Modern pilots would later measure the G-forces involved in aerial combat, discover that turning fights regularly subjected pilots to 4, 5, even 6 times the force of gravity. At 6 Gs, a pilot's body effectively weighed 6 times its normal weight. Arms became impossibly heavy. Heads weighed as much as a bowling ball. Blood drained from the brain toward the feet, causing tunnel vision and, if sustained too long, complete blackout. Buck was fighting these effects constantly, tensing his leg and abdominal muscles to force blood back to his brain, grunting and breathing in short, sharp gasps to maintain consciousness during sustained turns. A 109 came at him from dead ahead, head on. It was a game of chicken, both pilots firing, closing at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour. Buck saw the Germans' guns winking, felt impacts on his aircraft, but he held his course and kept firing. At the last possible instant, the German pilot broke left. Buck's rounds caught him just as he turned, and the 109 cartwheeled through the sky, trailing debris. Buck's stick went nearly neutral. His hydraulics were failing. Without hydraulic pressure, the massive control surfaces of the P-47 were almost impossible to move. He was flying with brute strength now, using both hands on the stick. His boots braced against the rudder pedals. Every maneuver was exhausting, every turn a battle against the aircraft itself. Below him, he caught a glimpse of Brandenburg. He'd been driven south during the fight, away from the bomber stream, deeper into Germany. He was alone over enemy territory in a dying aircraft with 33 German fighters still trying to kill him. 2 he'd shot down, but the rest were relentless. Then Major Wilhelm Kruger arrived. Buck didn't know his name at the time, wouldn't learn it until after the war when historians pieced together the Luftwaffe records, but he recognized immediately that this pilot was different. The new 109 that appeared flew with a confidence and precision that spoke of hundreds of hours of combat experience. It wore the markings of an expertise, a high-scoring ace. Kruger made his approach perfectly, cutting off Buck's escape route, forcing him into a turning fight where the nimbler 109 had the advantage. Buck pulled as hard as he dared with his damage controls, the P-47 shaking violently on the edge of a stall. Kruger stayed with him, slowly gaining position. Buck could see the German pilot's helmeted head in the cockpit, could imagine the concentration on his face. They circled each other like ancient gladiators, altitude bleeding away, both aircraft at minimum controllable speed. Buck's arms burned with fatigue. Sweat poured down his face despite the freezing temperature. Kruger was getting behind him, sliding into the killing position. Buck could feel it happening, could see it in his peripheral vision, but he couldn't stop it. His aircraft wouldn't respond fast enough. Then Buck did something that went against every instinct, every bit of training. He chopped his throttle completely and deployed his flaps. The P-47 slowed dramatically, violently. Kruger shot past him, overshooting, suddenly in front instead of behind. Buck's guns were empty, but Kruger didn't know that. The German pilot broke hard right and dived, giving up his advantage rather than risk flying in front of an enemy fighter. Buck retracted his flaps, pushed his throttle forward, and pointed his nose west. He was done. He'd held them as long as he could, longer than should have been possible. The bombers were gone, either having completed their mission or been driven off. It was time to try to get home. The German fighters followed, but they were low on fuel too after the extended engagement. They made half-hearted passes, firing from long range, but they didn't press their attacks. One by one, they broke off and headed for their bases. Soon, Buck was alone in the sky, limping west at 200 miles per hour in an aircraft that should have fallen apart an hour ago. He crossed back into occupied territory over Luxembourg, flying at treetop level to avoid radar. His engine was running rough now, missing badly, and he could smell burning oil. The instrument panel was a mess of red warning lights, oil pressure low, hydraulic pressure 0, fuel critically low, engine temperature high. But still, Prairie Thunder flew. At this altitude, Buck could see individual trees, could make out roads and buildings flashing past beneath him. He was flying so low that farmers in their fields looked up in shock as the battered P-47 roared overhead. The engine was making terrible sounds now, grinding and clanking, clearly on the verge of catastrophic failure. Every second it continued to run was a minor miracle, a testament to the durability of its design and the skill of the mechanics who'd maintained it. Buck's hands were cramping from gripping the controls so tightly. Without hydraulic assist, every control input required significant physical force. His arms felt like lead, his shoulders burned with fatigue, but he couldn't relax his grip even for a second. The P-47 wanted to roll right because of the damaged wing, and it took constant pressure on the stick to keep the wings level. His feet worked the rudder pedals constantly, making small corrections to keep the nose pointed where he needed to go. The French countryside passed beneath him in a blur. He crossed the Moselle River, then the Meuse, each landmark bringing him closer to safety, but also reminding him how far he still had to go. The distance from Luxembourg to the English Channel was over 200 miles, and he was flying a dying aircraft on fumes. The fuel gauge was reading empty now, running on whatever drops remained in the lines and the tanks. The engine could quit at any moment, and when it did, Buck would have seconds to find a place to put down before he became a smoking crater in some French field. He made it to the channel, saw the gray waters ahead, and felt a surge of hope. The engine chose that moment to seize. 1 second it was running. The next, it locked up with a grinding screech of metal on metal. The propeller stopped, and suddenly Buck was flying a 7-ton glider with the aerodynamic properties of a brick. The silence was shocking. For hours, Buck's world had been filled with the roar of the engine, the rattle of gunfire, the whistle of wind through damaged metal. Now, suddenly, there was only the rushing of air past the canopy and the creaking of overstressed airframe components. It was peaceful almost, surreal, like the eye of a hurricane. Buck's training took over immediately. He trimmed the aircraft for best glide speed, approximately 140 knots, which would give him maximum distance before he hit the water. He was at about 2,000 feet altitude, which meant he had perhaps 3 or 4 minutes of gliding flight remaining. Not much time, but enough to prepare. He radioed his position, gave a quick situation report, then prepared to ditch. The water was cold enough to kill him in minutes, but he had his May West life preserver and his survival training. He had a chance, which was more than he'd had 15 minutes ago over Germany. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Lead Bottle Blue Leader. I'm going in the channel approximately 5 miles north of Cap Grinet. Engine failure. Preparing to ditch. Over. The radio crackled, and he heard Major Jameson's voice, tight with concern. Blue Leader, Lead Bottle Leader, we copy your mayday. Air Sea Rescue has been notified. British rescue launch is being scrambled from Dover. Hang on, Buck. Help is coming. Roger that. Going in now. Blue Leader out. Buck cinched his harness tight, making sure it was secure but would release easily when he needed it to. He ditched his oxygen mask, no longer needed at low altitude, and checked that his May West was properly positioned. The yellow life preserver was folded flat against his chest, ready to be inflated by pulling 2 tabs that would trigger CO2 cartridges. He also had a one-man life raft in his seat pack, though he wasn't sure he'd have time to deploy it before the aircraft sank. The channel was rough today, whitecaps visible on the dark water. Buck lined up parallel to the waves, knowing that ditching perpendicular to them could flip the aircraft or break it apart. He needed to bring the P-47 down as smoothly as possible, tail first, letting the tail take the initial impact and slowing the aircraft before the nose hit. It was a delicate maneuver that required perfect timing and touch. Buck lined up parallel to the waves, trimmed the aircraft as best he could with no power, and brought it down. The impact was tremendous. The P-47 hit the water like a sledgehammer hitting concrete. Buck's head snapped forward, his face slamming into the gun sight despite his harness. Blood poured from his broken nose. Water rushed into the cockpit from a dozen places. The shock of impact was like being in a car crash. Everything happened at once. The airframe groaned and twisted. Metal buckled and tore. The canopy, already cracked from combat damage, shattered completely, and frigid water exploded into the cockpit. Buck's head rang from the impact with the gun sight, and he could taste blood in his mouth. For a moment, he was disoriented, unsure which way was up, his vision swimming. Then survival instinct kicked in. Move! Get out! Now! He fumbled with his harness release, his cold fingers clumsy. The water was up to his chest now. Finally, the release clicked, and he was free. He climbed out of the sinking aircraft, inflated his May West, and kicked away from the wreckage. Prairie Thunder went down quickly, nose first, and disappeared beneath the gray waves. The cold hit him like a physical blow. The English Channel in March was barely above freezing, perhaps 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. The shock of immersion in water that cold was overwhelming. Buck's body reacted instinctively, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow, his heart rate spiking. This was the first stage of cold water immersion, the cold shock response, and it was dangerous. Men had drowned in survivable conditions simply because the cold shock caused them to gasp and inhale water, or because it triggered cardiac arrest in those with weak hearts. Buck floated in the channel, alone, in water so cold it felt like knives stabbing into his skin. He He'd survived 37 minutes against 35 of Germany's best fighter pilots. He'd shot down 21 enemy aircraft in his career. He'd protected those bombers as long as humanly possible. And now he was going to die of hypothermia in the English Channel, 3 miles from safety. His extremities were already going numb. Fingers, toes, ears, nose, all losing sensation rapidly. His core was trying to preserve itself by cutting off blood flow to less vital areas. But that meant his arms and legs were becoming less responsive, making it harder to swim, harder to keep his head above water. The Mae West kept him afloat, but waves kept washing over his face, and he had to fight to keep from inhaling seawater. Time lost meaning. Minutes felt like hours. Buck focused on breathing, on staying conscious, on not giving up. He thought about Nebraska, about his family's farm, about summer thunderstorms rolling across the plains. He thought about his mother's cooking, his father's quiet strength, the girl back home who'd promised to wait for him. He thought about Tommy Walsh and hoped the kid had made it home. He thought about Prairie Thunder, the aircraft that had saved his life so many times, now resting on the bottom of the channel. But fate had other plans. A British rescue launch spotted him 12 minutes later, drawn by his radio call. They pulled him from the water, wrapped him in blankets, and gave him hot tea laced with rum. Buck Henderson was shaking so hard he could barely hold the cup, but he was alive. The rescue launch was a converted fishing boat manned by British sailors who'd saved dozens of downed pilots. They knew their business. Strong hands grabbed Buck and hauled him aboard like a landed fish. Someone stripped off his wet flight jacket and wrapped him in wool blankets. Someone else pressed a cup of tea into his hands, the liquid scalding hot and sweetened with sugar, and fortified with a generous splash of rum. "You're a lucky bastard, Yank," one of the sailors said, his accent thick with Cockney. "Another 5 minutes in that water and you'd be done for. As it is, you're going to feel like absolute hell for a while, but you'll live." Buck couldn't respond. His teeth were chattering too hard to speak. But he managed a nod of thanks, grateful beyond words, for these men who risked their lives in the channel to save pilots like him. The debrief at RAF Bottisham took 3 hours. Intelligence officers couldn't believe his story. One pilot, alone, against 35 enemy fighters for 37 minutes, shooting down 3 of them and living to tell about it? It was impossible. But Buck's gun camera footage backed up every word. So did the testimonies of bomber crews who'd seen parts of the engagement. So did the Luftwaffe's own records, recovered after the war. Tommy Walsh was waiting when Buck finally emerged from the debrief. The young lieutenant's eyes were red. "I thought you were dead, sir. I saw you go into that cloud of fighters, and I thought that was it." Buck put a hand on Walsh's shoulder. "You did the right thing, breaking off. No point in both of us dying. How did you do it? How did you survive that?" Buck was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know, Tommy. I really don't. That aircraft, that beautiful, tough, unbreakable aircraft, it saved my life a dozen times over, and maybe I got lucky. Maybe those German pilots got a little careless, thought I was already finished, or maybe God wasn't ready for me yet." Major Jameson appeared, his weathered face showing rare emotion. "Henderson, I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Service Cross. What you did up there, drawing off that many fighters, giving the bombers time to complete their run, that saved lives. A lot of lives." Buck nodded, too exhausted to feel pride or satisfaction. He just wanted to sleep, to stop seeing tracers and burning aircraft when he closed his eyes. But he knew that wouldn't happen. It never did after a mission like this. The story of Buck Henderson's impossible survival spread through the 8th Air Force like wildfire. Pilots who heard it were split between belief and skepticism. Some thought it was exaggerated war mythology. Others, particularly those who flew the P-47, understood completely. They knew what that aircraft could do, how much punishment it could take. After the war, military historians studied the engagement in detail. They interviewed surviving German pilots, including Major Wilhelm Kruger, who confirmed every aspect of Buck's account. Kruger, who had 43 kills to his credit, said in a 1952 interview, "I have never seen such flying, such determination. That American pilot, he should have died 10 times. His aircraft should have fallen from the sky. But he kept fighting, kept maneuvering. It was the most remarkable display of skill and courage I witnessed in the entire war. And that aircraft, the Thunderbolt, it was a fortress in the sky. We hit it again and again, and it simply would not die." The engagement became a case study at military academies worldwide. Tacticians analyzed Buck's decisions, the way he used his aircraft's strengths to compensate for its weaknesses and damage. Engineers studied the battle damage reports on Prairie Thunder, using the data to improve future aircraft designs. Pilots learned from his aggressive tactics, his refusal to give up, his ability to improvise under impossible circumstances. Buck Henderson flew 43 more missions before the war ended. He survived them all. He returned to Nebraska in 1946, married his childhood sweetheart Mary, and bought a small farm outside Grand Island. He never talked much about the war, as was common with his generation, but sometimes on summer evenings when thunderstorms rolled across the prairie, he would sit on his porch and watch the lightning, and Mary would see him smile slightly, lost in memories of a different thunder, the roar of an R-2800 engine at full power. He passed away in 1998 at the age of 78. At his funeral, 7 P-47 Thunderbolts from the Commemorative Air Force flew overhead in the missing man formation. Tommy Walsh, by then a retired Air Force colonel, gave the eulogy. "Buck Henderson was the finest pilot I ever knew," Walsh said, his voice breaking slightly. "But more than that, he was the finest man. What he did on March 15th, 1944, defied belief then, and it defies belief now. One man, one aircraft, against impossible odds. He didn't run. He didn't quit. He stayed and fought because bomber crews were counting on him. That's who Buck Henderson was. That's the legacy he leaves behind." The story of that March day over Brandenburg became a part of aviation legend. The 37-minute engagement that should have been impossible. The lone P-47 Thunderbolt that refused to die. The pilot who faced down 35 aces and lived to tell the tale. It's studied in flight schools, written about in history books, and remembered by anyone who understands what courage truly means. Military historians still debate aspects of the engagement. How did Buck's aircraft remain flyable with that much battle damage? How did he maintain the energy and situational awareness necessary to survive against such overwhelming odds? The answers involve complex discussions of aircraft engineering, pilot skill, tactical decision-making, and yes, a certain amount of luck. But perhaps the simplest answer is this. Buck Henderson refused to die, and he was flying an aircraft that was built to bring its pilot home no matter what. The P-47. Thunderbolt earned its reputation as one of the toughest fighters of World War II, in large part because of missions like Buck Henderson's. Over 12,000 were built during the war. They flew over 546,000 combat sorties. The loss rate was among the lowest of any Allied fighter, testament to its rugged construction. Pilots loved it for its ability to absorb damage, its powerful engine, its heavy armament, and its dive performance. In the skies over Europe, it became a symbol of American industrial might and engineering excellence. Today, a few dozen P-47 Thunderbolts still fly, preserved by dedicated organizations and individuals who understand their historical significance. When one takes off, the thunderous roar of that massive radial engine evokes an era when the sky was a battlefield and survival depended on the aircraft beneath you and the skill in your hands. It's a sound that Buck Henderson carried with him for 54 years after that March day, a sound that meant power, safety, and home. The lessons from Buck Henderson's encounter with 35 Luftwaffe aces remain relevant today. His story teaches us about the importance of training, about staying calm under pressure, about using every resource available to accomplish the mission. It reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. It demonstrates that good engineering and design can mean the difference between life and death in combat. And it shows us that sometimes, against all odds and logic, the human spirit combined with the right tools can achieve the impossible. March 15th, 1944, was just another day in a long war for most people. But in the skies over Brandenburg, something extraordinary happened. One American pilot in one American fighter aircraft faced down 35 of Germany's best and survived. It was a feat that shocked military historians then and continues to amaze them now. It was proof that sometimes reality is more incredible than any fiction could ever be. Buck Henderson always insisted he was just doing his job that day, that any other pilot would have done the same. Those who knew him, who flew with him, disagreed. They understood that what happened in those 37 minutes was something special, something that transcended normal combat operations. It was a perfect convergence of machine, man, training, determination, and yes, a little bit of luck. But mostly it was about a farm boy from Nebraska who found himself in an impossible situation and simply refused to give up, who trusted his aircraft and his skills and fought with everything he had because bomber crews were counting on him. That's the story of Buck Henderson and Prairie Thunder. That's the story of one P-47 Thunderbolt and 35 Luftwaffe aces. That's the story that military historians still study, still marvel at, still use as an example of what's possible when courage meets capability. It's a story that deserves to be remembered, to be told, to inspire future generations who face their own impossible odds. Because if Buck Henderson could survive 37 minutes against 35 aces, then perhaps we can all find the strength to face whatever challenges come our way.